Hi, I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. You're watching the Western Standard's Pipeline on today is Wednesday, December 9th, 2020. Thankfully, 2020 is almost over, but it seems like it's going to continue on for a bit longer now. Joining me today is Western Standard news editor Dave Naylor. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Derek. Good to be with you.
And Western Standard podcast editor and columnist Cory Morgan. Good day, Cory.
Good day.
Today, we're going to be going through the latest of what's happening across the West and in Ottawa affecting the West. We're going to be dealing with the government that stole Christmas. Governments across the West, including the holdouts in Alberta and Saskatchewan, are now in full lockdown. Christmas is canceled. We'll be talking about that. Federal Finance Minister and pseudo-Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland warns that Canadians have too much money right now and that they need to spend it, talking about ways that the government can unleash the heavy pockets of Canadians. And Krampus, the German Christmas monster, reigns terror in Calgary, terrifying people, leading to police calls from people with nothing better to do. So we're going to start with I think it brings back to stealing Christmas, the government that stole Christmas. We've got lockdowns in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the rest of the East on the advice of Ottawa. Alberta now following the lead of British Columbia with a total and complete lockdown. Dave, why don't you tell our viewers what exactly is happening? What is this new lockdown? And what does this really mean for the holidays? If you could talk about it in Alberta here, where it's probably getting the biggest news, but also across the West where similar measures are now in place.
Premier Kenney announced them last night, Derek, calling them, quote, dramatic measures. And what it means is basically the end to anything Christmassy in Alberta. Christmas gatherings in your home are now banned. Any outdoor activity whatsoever is banned. So there'll be no caroling through the streets of Stephen Avenue Mall. A lot of stuff mirrors the earlier lockdown that we had in the spring. Pubs and restaurants will be closed as of 12:01 on Sunday morning. They'll be closed for in-house dining and drinking, but curbside menu takeouts are still being allowed. He says that Alberta has handled the pandemic better than most jurisdictions. He's been under a lot of pressure to bring in more restrictions as the numbers have soared in Calgary recently. We're averaging, I think, about 1,700 a day. Which is an absolutely incredible figure with a positivity rate of close to 10%. Casinos are now shut, as are fitness centers, hair salons, any sort of personal service like that are closed. Bingo halls are closed, pool halls, legions. The malls are going to be allowed to remain open, but they're going to be cutting their capacity to only 15%. So that's going to mean some crazy Christmas shopping lineups. And I cannot even imagine what the lineup at Costco is going to be. It'll be several blocks long, I'm sure. That capacity limit is also in effect for funerals and weddings at a 10-person limit. They say that single people are allowed to have 2 contacts that they can have into their house, but those 2 contacts have to stay the same. Things like libraries, museums, galleries are all closed. You can still go skiing, though, if you want, as long as the resorts, maintain the social distancing required. And Alberta has finally ordered a mandatory mask across the entire province. We were the last province to bring in those mandatory mask orders. Schools, there'll be no changes to the way it's operating. The grades 7 to 12 will still stay in homeschooling, and grades 1 through 6 will still continue to be allowed to have in-school progress. They did have an announcement that they're updating their small business grant program. They're actually quadrupling it. Started out as $5,000 and it's now up to $20,000 to help out these poor businesses that are being closed again. The first round of closures in the spring cost 30,000 businesses problems, and it caused 300,000 layoffs, an incredible amount, and no reason to think that figure won't be similar again. So really all-encompassing order that, yeah, it does ruin Christmas for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's quite something. I think these measures are pretty much what we're seeing right across the West. Obviously, we're more familiar with what's happening in Alberta here, but we're seeing a pretty much uniform set of lockdowns everywhere. Cory, Jason Kenney has been probably the most reticent of the premiers to impose these kinds of lockdowns, mandatory face masks, and things like that. I'd like your take on why do you think, first, he held off on doing this, and second, why he is doing it now. Is it primarily he believes it's necessary, or is this caving to political pressure?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's made it pretty clear. I mean, he wants, I think ideologically, he really does believe in trying to leave business alone as much as possible. He does understand we need to try and keep what little we can of this economy moving. And he understands that this is going to castrate and completely bankrupt a great number of businesses. But the political pressure became too much. The infections kept going up. The deaths are going up. The ICU bed use is going up. You know, we don't have them stacked like cordwood in the streets like Notley's making it out to be. But there is a trend that has got a lot of Albertans freaked out. We can talk about where that pressure is coming from. I mean, the NDP with Notley has been outright hysteric for 6 months on pushing for a lockdown. Now Nenchi's screaming and howling for a lockdown. Now Iveson's screaming and howling for a lockdown. Most of the mainstream media has been screaming and howling for a lockdown. And throughout all of this, I went last weekend to see, well, is the public pushing back against the lockdown? And I went downtown and about 500 people were gathered. It wasn't a giant rational groundswell that's going to tell the premier that the public doesn't want this. Whether or not this lockdown is effective or a good idea, I don't believe so, but I also believe the government was cornered. I don't know where else Kenney could go. I mean, his support numbers are going deep into the toilet. Now he's ticked off both sides, but it was just inevitable, I'm afraid.
It does seem to be a combination of, you know, an actual increase in infections and deaths, but it seems that politics is driving most of this. I think, you know, Kenney's instincts are not to do something like this. These actions are inherently authoritarian. He might be comfortable with authoritarianism in some aspects, but I think when it comes to people going about their lives and operating businesses, I think his instincts are probably correct. So I don't think he wants to do this. But I think it's, you know, things have gotten worse. We are in a second wave, but we're now seeing a policy dictated, I think, by polls. The mainstream media have been uniformly demanding lockdowns. Probably the most loud of these voices would be the Calgary Herald's Don Braid, who I think provides generally good political analysis, as you know, analysis of the landscape, the horse race, that kind of thing, but has been taking a particularly political and ideological track in his columns of late, saying that the premier will have blood on his hands for all of these deaths. You saw a reporter in a press conference with Jason Kenney. I forget with which outlet was this where that rather loaded question came, Dave? Do you recall?
It was Sammy Hudis from the Calgary Herald. Okay.
You know, I've been in question period, and 9/10 of your statement is not a question; it's an indictment. It's a preamble about why the government's so terrible. His question to the premier sounded very much like that, and I thought Jason Kenney was actually right in calling him out and saying that sounds more like an NDP question in the legislature than something that should come from the press. I think it's a case of where a reporter wants to be the story himself rather than the contents of the story, trying to make a name for himself. And you saw the mainstream media kind of rally around this guy, where I think it was, you know, the question itself, when he finally got to a question, it's a fair question, you know, do you take responsibility for these deaths? I don't think I don't think the premier is responsible for it, but I think it's a fair question. But I think this whole preamble around it, the media feel very righteous in what they're doing, and their line is indistinguishable from the NDP's right now. But it is funny, just roughly a week ago, may have actually been exactly a week ago, you had Rachel Notley, she was on Danielle Smith's show, 770 CHQR, saying that bars and restaurants should be cut down, and Jason Kenney pilloried her for that statement. And 1 week later, if I'm not mistaken, this is now official government policy. Bars and restaurants are shut down. And not just that, you can't even have people in your home. You can't even have your family over for Christmas legally. Now, as I've said before, people should make their own choices about if that's an acceptable risk or not. And if you think it is an acceptable risk, go ahead and do it. The government cannot enter your home without a warrant. Draw your blinds. Post the Charter of Rights. Take the Charter of Rights to your door. And if the government comes to your door, you have one question. Do you have a warrant? If the answer is no, or anything other than yes, close the door and have no further conversation, because you're not required to. But it is an extraordinary measure for the government to be telling people that they can't even have close family and friends over for Christmas in their own homes. But I think this is a case where politics has gotten the better of it. If Jason Kenney truly feels that, while it's unfortunate but necessary for these actions, he should have stuck to it. Right now, we're kind of bouncing between Sweden and Ontario. We're going between extreme lockdown and having relatively more liberties. And we're getting the worst of both worlds. We're not getting the herd immunity that would come with a more laissez-faire model, and we're not getting the lack of transmission that you would get from a total lockdown. We're getting the worst of both worlds. So now we're likely to have a longer lockdown than something like Ontario. Lockdowns only work when everybody does it, and I don't think there's going to be that kind of compliance for it anymore. The governments across Canada and across the world have just lost the trust of their people to too much of a degree. But Alberta's been bouncing around from one extreme to another. And while it might be at one extreme very grudgingly, it's got to pick a lane. And I think we've got the worst of both worlds for that. And it's now cost us Christmas and could go well into the new year.
Derek, you bring up a good point when you mention the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I was talking to John Carpay at the Calgary rally. He's the head of the Canadian Centre for Constitutional Freedom. His group has now filed a lawsuit against the Alberta government, specifically looking at whether these measures are an infringement of the rights and freedoms. He says that lawsuits will also be coming before Christmas against the government in BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So he's taking his crusade across the country. And Premier Kenney actually briefly mentioned the Charter of Rights in his lockdown statement yesterday, saying, quote unquote, some of the rights are, quote, being adjourned, unquote. So I don't think he feels overly comfortable with some of the measures himself, and it'll be interesting to see what the courts say.
Yeah, indeed. Cory, do you have anything else to add on the lockdowns? And what do you think would be the political fallout from this? Do you think that in the end, when this is all said and done, that people who are more skeptical of state power on the right, who are part of the UCP coalition, are they going to at the end shrug and say, well, he was probably right in the end when this is all done? Are they going to shrug and say, I hated it, it was wrong, but I have no other choice? Or do you think this is going to create any kind of real breach between Jason Kenney and the UCP base?
I think it's going to cause that breach. He had been trying to walk both sides. Kenney had been trying, as you said, to be reticent about locking down. But now he's actually kind of basically managed to piss off everybody. No matter what happens, he's going to get it. I mean, I don't feel, and as you said, that these lockdowns are really going to halt the infection spread. I don't think it's going to make much difference. And then, of course, he's going to be pilloried by the media and all the rest of the people that we mentioned, because they're saying, well, that's because he started too late and he let the cat out and it's done. What we're also going to see, I mean, I owned a restaurant for years. It's a brutal, tough business at the best of times. Every time we do this, there's going to be a great deal more of them that even when the restrictions rise, they're not going to be there anymore. They're going to be gone. Those jobs are going to be gone. The jobs supplying the restaurants are going to be gone. as well, you know, in hospitality, hotels, retail. This is just an ongoing catastrophe. And he's going to wear it. It's going to be a real ugly year for the UCP to try and regain trust of the Albertans right now.
Indeed. I don't think these kinds of voters are going to necessarily go to the NDP, but I think it could see them bolt to one of the upstart parties on the right, or stay home if he doesn't do something very significant to try and bring these people back within his tent. Before we move on to Chrystia Freeland here, I just want to remind everybody, if you are not yet a Western Standard member, please, while you're watching, go to westernstandardonline.com and click on the membership section right on the top menu. Become a member. For just a few bucks a month, you can help support a truly independent and Western media. We refuse to accept any government subsidies from the very first day we launched, and we're committed to it. So please take some time and support us if you want to see things like the Western Standard continue. We've been doing a lot of work. We've been expanding our operations. We've just established a new Ottawa bureau so we can keep an eye on the national capital and everything that it attempts to do with the West, having a truly Western voice there. So please try to support our actions by signing up as a member of the Western Standard. But let's, speaking of Ottawa, let's turn to Ottawa. Chrystia Freeland, shadow prime minister, if you will, has said that Canadians have too much money in their pockets and it needs to be spent to stimulate the economy. Dave, why don't you tell us what the heck she's talking about?
It's a bit of a head scratcher. She was doing an interview with Bloomberg and said that Canadians have managed to save a tidy sum of money during the pandemic. She obviously hasn't peered into my bank account, but she says that there's been nothing for people to do or spend their money on. She says international travel is difficult, and Canadians have been storing the money away. She says what she wants is a, quote, preloaded stimulus, unquote, where Canadians start spending that money and pull it out of their bank accounts and get the economy going again. Everybody, of course, is worried about what she really means, and what she really means is the Trudeau government is going to try and find some sort of way to get access to that cash. Pierre Poilievre, the Tory finance critic, urged Canadians to lock up their money. And there's been various internet memes of people digging holes in their backyard to hide their money in. But it was an interesting thing for, as you said, the de facto prime minister of the country to say. And people are worried about what she really is up to.
Cory, what do you think is the reasoning behind what she's doing here? Does the government truly believe that Canadians have too much disposable income right now? I mean, with things being closed, either completely closed or partially closed for so long, I mean, there is less ability to spend your money on retail in many cases. I mean, this year, for the first time since I was a little kid, I went and got my Christmas tree off of Crown land in Kananaskis country. The government, I think, pretty wisely waived the $5 fee to get your permit. Not that it saved people much money, but it encouraged people to do it. Out in K country, there were hundreds of cars in the middle of the winter out traipsing through the bushes. There were probably, I said hundreds of cars, probably filled with families. People went out. People are spending more time outdoors doing things. So there are some positive aspects to all this. But people are spending less money, have less ability to spend their disposable income right now. But people's incomes have been dramatically reduced. And I think people are worried and rightfully putting a larger priority on savings, something that Canadians have a very bad habit of not doing, where they, I think, one of the most indebted, private sector indebted people on the planet. Do you think, regardless of what she says about getting people to spend their money, do you think she has a point, though, that people aren't spending enough money in the economy right now?
No. I mean, people aren't spending it, but that's due to necessity. Yeah, people are looking for different alternatives, to get out, and that's why it was popular for everybody to go out for the Christmas trees. I watched that interview a couple of times, and I had to listen because the language is really important in that and what she was doing. You notice she also didn't just say Canadians are saving too much money. She made a point of saying the well-off. Like, she's playing the politics of envy. And the other thing she did in that interview was invite people, say, how can you? She says, ideally, people will just do it on their own. But if not, listeners, please let me know, how can we unlock that money? I mean, this is frightening political gamesmanship. I mean, if you're going to do something and then try and claim it's because it's the will of the people, this is exactly the crap you pull. You say, look, I invited people, and they said what we should do is have a tax on these well-to-do people that are saving too much excess capital. They're realizing that they're against the wall. They're realizing that the spending's unsustainable. They're realizing there's nothing going on to keep this economy rolling, and they're looking to where somebody might have some money squirreled away, and they're starting to play those games. If anything, it's a boon to cryptocurrencies and many other things. People are going to be scrambling to find ways to hide their money from this government, because this is a desperate government that have spent themselves blind, that are going to continue to do so. And they're going to come after our savings. You hear that when they talk about inheritance taxes and going back into capital gains and things like that too. They don't want us to build up too much, and they're going to punish us for it. It was a very striking interview and distressing, to be honest.
Well, I suppose Canadian governments, federal and provincial, have a very poor record when it comes to saving themselves. Most of the country are running deficits. The federal government, Alberta, are running record deficits. Record deficit doesn't even do it justice. These are far beyond even previous record deficits, even adjusted for inflation and GDP relative to the First and Second World Wars. We're going to take on more debt this year than it took to fight Kaiser Wilhelm and Hitler. These are staggering sums of money, and governments like the idea of borrowing and spending and not saving for themselves. Now it seems to be official government policy that this is what they want to see elsewhere. Not that it's anything necessarily new. They're just saying it now. But governments have been incentivizing borrowing and spending and punishing savings for a long time by debasing the currency, by printing free money to go to major chartered banks. This is policy across most of the Western world, not just in Canada. Canada's just particularly bad. But our governments are hell-bent on making sure we're not saving, but that we're borrowing and spending right now. And the only ones who are going to like this are the banks. Well, let's, in the spirit of more bad news at Christmas, let's bring it closer back to home to the Western Standards offices in Calgary, Alberta. We have had the terrifying prospect of a Krampus going door to door in Calgary's Curry neighborhood. Terrifying prospect. Dave, why don't you tell us about the latest terror in Calgary, and what have been the response from local residents who have been faced with the Krampus?
Yeah, certainly my favorite story of 2020 so far, Derek. Krampus is an old German legend, and as you can see in that picture, he's quite horrifying. He's quite scary looking. And what he does came about in Germany and Central Europe. He and St. Nicholas go and visit the kids, and they determine which kid is being naughty and which kid is being nice. Krampus, when he finds a naughty kid, beats him with bags of sticks or bundles of sticks. The really, really bad kids, they get kidnapped and taken straight to hell. So you can imagine the poor children of Germany. This would have put the fear of God into them. So somebody this week in Calgary decided to put on the Krampus outfit and go knocking on some doors. The picture we had up earlier of him knocking at the door was actually taken by a resident who was quite rightly terrified, didn't know what the hell was going on, and ended up calling the police. So I'm sure the guy had quite the explanation for them when police arrived. But he ran into some other kids down in the Curry neighborhood, and he explained to their parent who he was and what he was doing. And I'm not sure if he threatened to beat kids with a stick, but tell you what, if he showed up at my door, I may be considering, and if I didn't know who he was, I might call the police too.
Yeah, I might be one of the few parents in Calgary who intends to raise their child with Krampus as a character in his child's Christmas memories. I think Krampus is the reason the German children are so well behaved. If you're bad, you get beaten with a bundle of sticks, and if you're really bad, he puts you in a bag and takes you straight to hell. I've got a Bavarian friend who was raised on this, and he's been beaten with the sticks. His cousin, I think he said, was put in a bag and cried, but since then has been very well behaved. So I think we need more Krampus. It's not just the German in me speaking. I think we would all be served by terrifying our children into behaving. You need both the carrot for the reindeer, and you need the stick from Krampus if you want the kids to be good, or if you want your kids to be nice.
I think bringing out Krampus at Christmas may get social services called on you, though.
Well, I'll have to get a warrant. Well, I think we'll actually answer some, if there's some questions. We've had a lot of comments today, but we'll kind of go through some of the questions and comments before we wrap up here. Kyle Balloman says it's looking more and more like 1984. He was referring, that comment was from when we were discussing the government that stole Christmas, these lockdowns. We are seeing increasingly, I think people need to be careful with the hyperbole. These are not Nazis. These are not fascists. I wouldn't even call it totalitarian, but it certainly is authoritarian. Those terms are subgroups of authoritarianism, and particularly extreme variants of it. I don't think they're particularly useful terms if we call Justin Trudeau or Jason Kenney Nazis or fascists. I think that kind of hyperbolic language denigrates the meaning of those terms. The left use them all the time for essentially anyone who disagrees with them. I think we should avoid falling into the same trap. But we are seeing certainly a new authoritarianism. We are seeing people very much yearning for the paternalistic strong man of the state to protect them. In Ontario, Doug Ford has become addicted to this. The more he clamps down on people's liberties, the higher his popularity goes. But he is facing a backlash, particularly from his own base. But in Ontario, there's not much people can do about that. We're not going to get to all of our comments here. A lot of good ones, some not so good ones. But maybe I'll get you to answer this one, Cory, from Chris Cuts. He says, wasn't it last week Kenny said how stupid it was to shut down businesses in spring, and a week later, here it is. Here he is to shut down again. Cory, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think with what he's talking about was particular with retail, actually, because it was in response to somebody talking about how the big box stores had been open, and meanwhile, while all the little stores have been shut down, so Walmart and Costco were doing fine, whereas the little ones were getting beat on. He admitted that it was a bad choice and it was a mistake. I think at another point too, it's actually when I'd interviewed him on a different podcast, but he did admit to making a mistake when they did that false start with reopening Calgary restaurants and then closed, days before they could open when they'd stocked up. So I think he's recognizing that he's done a lot of damage to businesses. But yeah, it's true. He was saying recently that it was poor to shut them down. It was a mistake, and then, well, now he's turned around and done it again. And perhaps that's part of the incentive, though, why they're keeping 15% of the malls, capacity open to at least not fully shut down retail. But it's going to have a similar effect.
And yeah. Guys, I don't know about you, but that's the first time I've heard Kenny ever admit he made a mistake. And he was quite, he called it a grave mistake. He was quite sincere with his apology. So first time I've heard him do that.
Yeah, if Kenny's admitting to a mistake, it must be a pretty serious one. James Kays in the same route, potentially even replying to the last comment, says he sure did and actually tried to apologize more than once. There's nothing genuine about him other than being another liberal follower. You can make the argument one way or another about how necessary or not this is, but Kenny does seem to be getting it from both sides here. The left, who are demanding a a total and complete severe lockdown early on, and then people who are disproportionately within the UCP voter coalition who resist this and are resisting it pretty vehemently. It's I guess I've already asked Cory this, but I'd like your take, Dave, about how much of a political problem do you think this is for Jason Kenney, in that a lot of his core followers do seem to have a sense of betrayal about this?
He's really in a no-win situation with this, I think, Derek. Many people are questioning why aren't we just coming out of the lockdown instead of just going into it? That he should have done this 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when the numbers started to skyrocket. So, yeah, he's under fire in a lot of his base. I think actually a lot of UCP supporters are thinking that, okay, this is the time to do it. Let's get it over and let's get it done with, and let's actually try and get this thing under control. There'll always be people that he won't be able to please by doing this. And certainly whatever he does, he could find a cure for COVID, and the NDP will be blasting him on a daily basis. So he's stuck in the middle. There's no doubt about that.
It seems to me if you're going to have a lockdown, you should have one extremely long and severe lockdown until there are 0 cases. You have to eradicate the virus from your borders, and then, like our rat patrol, keep anything out that is potentially infectious. This goes back to, for whatever you think about him, Donald Trump talking about closing America's borders. He was the first to shut it down with China. Everybody says was a bigot. People who talked about shutting down international travel early on, they were all called racist, bigots. Every ism in the book there. If you're going to have a lockdown, you do one extreme and long lockdown. You get to 0 cases, and then you essentially lock your borders when that's done. But simply having one lockdown and then second lockdown, I guarantee you this is not the last lockdown. Lockdowns will only work unless you do it to eradicate, not to bend the curve. Remember this 2 weeks to bend the curve thing? Well, that lasted months. And then we went to increasingly eased restrictions, never out of these lockdowns completely, but increasingly eased up restrictions. And now we're back into total and complete lockdown. There's no point of that. You do one if you're going to do a lockdown, if you're going to take the statist control route here, you do one lockdown and you eradicate things. I guarantee you, if the government's going to probably lift this as soon as things ease up a bit, but then we're going to be back into another lockdown. They've shown that they're going to respond to media pressure. They're going to respond to polls, and this is probably not the end of it. We have strange comment from Jacqueline Martin, who says, bullshit, the deaths in ICU are going up. Is this the CBC? Perhaps, Jacqueline, you can shed more light on your comment. I'm not sure I completely understand. Yes, deaths in ICU numbers are going up. But I'm not sure how us discussing a balance of this would make us the CBC. The CBC's coverage are about, yes, deaths and ICU ICU rates going up, but how we need to lock everything down. I think this conversation is rather different from the CBC. So perhaps I'm just not understanding your comment entirely. Feel free to add to your comments. Cory, do you have any take on that?
Well, that was back when I was mentioning that the deaths and the ICU numbers are going up. There are some people who believe that it's not true, or that it's myth, or that there's misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis. I don't know. I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time. Another thing I think that the Alberta government has done has been very transparent about their numbers, their hospitalizations. Again, it's a totally separate discussion of whether it's effective or not or whatever. But the numbers coming from the government say that the deaths are going up. There's daily deaths of 18, 20 people, that the ICU beds are starting to fill. I believe those numbers. Some people don't, I guess.
We've got an interesting statement, potentially a fact. We haven't verified this, but Jarrett Bonnet says Blaine Calkins, the Red Deer MP, was in a school in Red Deer reading to kids with no mask on. Red Deer has an indoor bylaw mask. Why and how does he become exempt? indoors after the law/rule has been in place and people have been ticketed. I'm not familiar with that. It's the first I've heard of it. Perhaps it's something for our intrepid news department to look into. I'm not a believer in mask mandates. I think people should voluntarily do this in indoor crowded places, like a school. I think that's probably an area where it warrants it. I think government mandating masks in a lot of areas is quite bizarre, but I think people should voluntarily do it in some places. But one of those places I think people should voluntarily wear a mask would be a school. The children are not at risk, but they certainly can be carriers. So, Dave, perhaps this is something for us to look into this afternoon. But
sure, I'm not sure what the mask rules are in Red Deer. Certainly in the Calgary school systems, masks are not required for kids. So I don't know if that's the same in Red Deer or not. But in Calgary, it's not a requirement.
Yeah, this is something we're going to just have to potentially look into. But so we can't really say much, Jared, until we've confirmed it. But thanks for bringing it to our attention. And for anyone, if anyone has news tips, yeah, feel free to email it to us, news@westernstandardonline.com. You can put it in the comments. We try to check them, but if you want to make sure it gets to our news side, just send it to Dave at news@westernstandardonline.com. Okay, well, we've got a lot of... well, actually, we'll finish up a little bit here. I can never pronounce this last name. Clinton Desvo. Clinton, let us know in the comments if I'm massacring that or not. There's a good chance I am. Clinton says, how many of the anti-maskers don't believe the virus actually exists? He follows up, what about mandatory vaccinations in order to travel on airplanes or cross the border? So kind of two different things. One is kind of the anti-mask thing. Dave and Cory, both of you have covered some of the Freedom Walk demonstrations in downtown Calgary. There have been similar demonstrations elsewhere in Alberta, across the West, and even in parts of Ontario, particularly where apparently barbecue is illegal, although I guess now barbecue is illegal in Alberta as well. I think there is a difference between... well, first of all, there are different kinds of anti-maskers. There are people who believe that you shouldn't wear a mask, and there are people who believe that the government shouldn't mandate you wear a mask. And I think there's a big distinction between them. I think responsible people should voluntarily wear a mask in certain circumstances, in crowded places. If you're, if you're on a train, if you're on an LRT, you should probably wear a mask. I think that's good courtesy and that's responsible citizenship. And that's a public place. I think a mask mandate in a place like an LRT probably makes sense. I don't think the government has any right to mandate masks on private property. I don't think the government has the right to mandate much of anything on private property. I think, but there's a difference between that kind of anti-masker, if you will, where you probably put me as an anti-compulsory mask on private property, and then anti-maskers who believe that they're outright bad. And then there are reasonable people who fall into both categories. And there are reasonable people who believe that they should be mandatory. I disagree with those people, but there are reasonable ones and there are extreme ones.
Cory and I went together to the anti-restriction rally in Calgary on Saturday at the Olympic Plaza. There are about 500 people there, none of them wearing a mask. I was, I think, the only one in the square block area that was wearing one. And there was a large percentage of those people that just think this is all a hoax. They were carrying signs saying, that the pandemic is not real. The pandemic is a hoax, and it's a creation of the media. I wouldn't say it's a huge percentage of the population, but it's a good percentage of those people that were down on the municipal plaza this weekend.
Cory, before we go on to Clint's second question, let's just deal with kind of the anti-mask thing. And I think there's a lot more nuance to it than most of the media are saying. I think we're trying to give a bit more nuance to it here, that there are very different kinds of anti-maskers, just as there are different kinds of pro-maskers. But you were down at the rally. I think you spoke about it on previous Pipeline broadcasts. What's your take in terms of the anti-maskers or people believing that the virus actually doesn't exist?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we've got is a lot of stressed people and a lot of mistrust of government and people who have areas of concern in general. I think that the downtown rally just turned into a place where they could all get together at the same time and vent. Some are similar to us, I guess, in that, I'm not fully against masks, but I just don't want the government legislating it. Or another thing, and I stirred up the social media hordes last Sunday and Monday on that, is that I was disappointed with when I went to the rally and their second speaker started down the rabbit hole of vaccines causing autism and all that, conspiracy crap. And I'm sorry, I'm calling it conspiracy crap. The autism thing, it's long been disproven, but this is what we're getting there. And, we got people saying it's a hoax, it's planned. Okay, well, whatever. Some people are going to believe that, but the majority don't. And that's why there's only 500 people on a sunny Saturday at one of these rallies. There's legitimate concerns out there. There's people who are concerned about a rushed vaccine. There's people who are concerned about possible effects from wearing a mask or things when you're doing workouts. But when it's the less rational folks at the front of the parade yelling, you're not going to draw your middle of the road people into these things. And right now, those protests are dominated by people, I guess, who are just kind of on a farther outreach, you could say.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of a good segue. We're going to come back to Clinton's second question because I think it's important. But Katie Swan says the virus is shit. The masks are shit. And then Mary Arsenault says, "I'm out. You guys actually believe the lies." Look, Mary, you're free to watch or not to watch. I think we give radically more balance than the overwhelming majority of the mainstream media do. Some of you, Kate Swan says this is all a hoax. No, it's not a hoax. To get every single government on the planet and the overwhelming majority of subnational governments like states and provinces all to believe this is, to get it on a hoax together, is you're giving government far too much credit to be competent. That's one reason I don't believe 9/11 was an inside job. Government is far too incompetent to pull something like that off and keep thousands and thousands of people singing from the same songbook. Look right here in Alberta at a caucus. It's hard to keep, 50 MLAs in a caucus saying the exact same thing. And they try extremely hard and have a lot of penalties if you don't. Imagine doing that with thousands of people who disagree vehemently. Donald Trump, a nationalist, a nationalist populist, doesn't believe it's a hoax, and neither does China, a communist dictatorship. I don't see what kind of common cause they could have. Now, there is a very good argument that there's been a lot of misinformation from governments and from supranational organizations like the World Health Organization. There is a lot of bullshit that's come from governments, and they've put out a lot of bad information. Is often put out false information. There's been wild censorship on social media from anyone dissenting from the official line. If your take on things don't comply with the WHO, you get taken off of social media. There is a lot to be skeptical of, but that does not make this a hoax. There are people dying. Shauna Lane, the digital editor of the Western Standard. I shouldn't disclose this, but I guess I just did. But I know people with coronavirus. There are people at the Western Standard, not in our offices, but I know people who have been infected. Dave and Cory know people who have been infected. This is real. These people are not in on a one world government conspiracy hoax here. This is a real thing. The severity of it and the responses to it, we can very much question those. There is, and feel free to question everything. Everything should be questioned. But this is not a hoax. It is a real thing. It is dangerous. But government responses to it and government information about it are highly suspect and have been discredited in many, many cases. And we're going to call that out when we see it. But at the Western Standard, we try to deal in the facts. We try to deal with evidence and proof. And the evidence is clearly there. This is not a hoax. This is a real thing. The question is, how do we respond to it, and how closely can we trust what the government is telling us? And rant. But I want to go to Clint's second question, because it's such an important one, and this follows very much in, I think, with what we've been talking about and what I just said. He said, "What about mandatory vaccinations in order to travel on airplanes across the border?" Very important, very topical question, and we're seeing stuff on this in Ontario, where Premier Ford is now contemplating vaccine passports. Now, my view on this might be controversial with some people. I believe in vaccines. They work most of the time, but like anything medical, anything man-made, they can go wrong. There have been bad vaccines in the past. There are some bad laws around liability for pharmaceutical companies that have produced vaccines with adverse effects. There are issues. I'm just going to put a blanket asterisk out there. There are issues with vaccines, but they are overwhelmingly a positive force for human health. They have eliminated things like polio. They have eliminated things like malaria. Things that used to kill millions of people every year are virtually extinct across the planet because of vaccines. Now, new vaccines should be taken with a bit more of a grain of salt. They have not been tested sufficiently. But Cory's said before in his columns that a vaccine is going to be our only way out of this. We're going to continue in more bloody lockdowns with high suicide rates, people losing their homes, people losing their businesses, people feeling socially isolated, not living like human beings were intended to live until we can end this. And the vaccine is the best way to do it. That said, there's a big difference between supporting vaccines and supporting mandatory vaccines. And we are seeing a lot of people and a lot of governments supporting some form of mandatory vaccines. And all of these people who, will put a bra on their head and march in a parade saying, "My body, my choice," to resist a government ban on a medical procedure, a lot of these very same people are calling for the government to mandate a procedure with people's bodies. And that is a terrifying prospect. If you are pro-choice of any kind, you cannot be pro-mandatory vaccination. And that goes for, I think it would be unconstitutional for the government to arrest you, pin you down, strap you to a bed and administer a vaccine. That is probably not going to be seen here. But what you could see is governments making it illegal for you to live your life as a human social creature unless you have a vaccine, this idea of a vaccine passport. And that is effectively making it mandatory, saying, we're not going to tranquilize you and administer the vaccine, but you can't live as a human being unless you have it. That is a terrifying prospect and should be resisted with everything people have. Again, between the government doing that and the private sector doing that. I controversially believe in the right of businesses to discriminate. I don't think they should in most cases. But, you can have dress codes. Businesses have I don't think governments have a right to mandate masks, but I think businesses do if they feel that is necessary. And if a business wants to require a vaccine, I think that's their choice. But there's a big difference between a business requiring it because it's private property and the government requiring it. But Dave, I'll put this to you.
Yeah, Premier Kenney has said repeatedly that it's not going to be mandatory in Alberta. But I think the issue of pandemic passport or a vaccine passport is clearly on the table. They just started vaccinating people in Great Britain this week, the first country in the world to do it. Ironically, one of the first people to get the vaccine was called William Shakespeare. But they are also talking about having to take the shot in order to get into things like soccer games. Ticketmaster in the States has said that you're going to have to prove you got the vaccine in order to get tickets to their events. So it's definitely on the table. As you mentioned, Ontario's now talking about it in some way, shape, or form. So I don't think it's ever going to become mandatory to have it. But as you say, life could be difficult without it, depending on what, if you want to travel. I think airlines will probably bring it in, but it could affect the way you live your life without getting the shot.
Cory, we're going to give the last word to you before we wrap it up.
Just that they're bizarre times. You know, I do appreciate the people rationally and closely watching things, because our individual rights are being infringed on. There are authoritarians who are eager to jump in and take advantage of the pandemic to whittle away at our individual rights, and we got to watch out for that. But I tell you, if you're going to scream from a crazed conspiracy theorist point of view on it, you're not changing the hearts and minds of the majority, which is what you're going to need to do.
Very good. Well, Dave, Cory, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank all of you watching for joining us. Those of you who are Western Standard members, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support of us. Again, if you are not yet a Western Standard member, it's important to support an independent media, a Western media that is not owned or operated out of central Canada, and that proudly refuses to accept government money. If you want there to be a media out there that is not funded by the government, it's important that you do so voluntarily. So please, if you're not yet a member of the Western Standard, go to westernstandardonline.com, click on membership near the top of the page on the menu bar, and sign up for just a few bucks a month. Thank you all very much for joining us today. It's been a slice. Stay safe, and we'll be back before Christmas.